You're live with BBC News. The Israeli government has sharply criticised a ruling by the Supreme Court which struck down judicial reforms. It said it was the wrong time for such a decision when Israel was at war and needed unity. The reforms sparked months of protests as the legislation limited the court's powers to cancel government decisions. Its opponents said it prevented proper oversight of the government. Well, the court was split in its decision. 8 judges voted in favour of striking down the law, while 7 voted to uphold it. Gideon Levy is in Tel Aviv. He's an Israeli journalist and columnist for the Haaretz newspaper. He says Benjamin Netanyahu's government is weaker after Israel's Supreme Court struck down the judicial reforms.
It's in any case weaker. You see the polls. There was never a government in war in Israel with so little support. Even though there is an overall support in continuing the war, the government itself gets very little trust and support. And after this ruling, it's even weaker. But this does not mean that Netanyahu is about to leave. It might take much more time.
Let's go live now to Tel Aviv, where we can speak to Ambassador Mark Regev, who's a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Why won't Prime Minister Netanyahu accept the ruling of the Supreme Court?
Well, the Prime Minister has not said anything publicly since that decision was taken by the court yesterday. He did speak before that when there were leaks about this decision, and he said this is not a time to be dealing with the issue of judicial reform. He said we should be focusing...
So in that case, do you think he should? Do you think he will accept it? He hasn't spoken publicly. Do you think he will accept it then?
I don't want to prejudge what he might say in the coming hours, but I can say this. His position has been consistent since the war has started, that we have to win this battle against Hamas, we have to destroy its military machine, and we have to end its rule over the Gaza Strip.
Yep.
It's a time for Israel, for national unity. It's clear that the issue of judicial reform was polarizing Israeli politics. You saw how it divided the court itself, 8 judges as to 7. It's an issue that is divisive, and the Prime Minister's opinion is that all issues that are divisive, we should put them aside now and focus on what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And that is winning the war.
Both the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, and Benny Gantz, who are both part of the War Cabinet, have said that the High Court of Justice rulings must be respected. Are you not putting at risk national unity if Netanyahu decides to be the standout in that group?
Well, these are 2 leading members of the government, and the Prime Minister will speak, I'm sure, on this issue in the coming hours, I presume so. But it must be remembered, and I think it's important that your viewers understand that when Hamas stormed the border on October 7th and indiscriminately murdered Israelis, yes, beheading, raping, burning people alive, massacring the young people at the music festival, they didn't ask beforehand, what is your opinion on judicial reform? They didn't ask, do you support or are you a political rival of the Prime Minister? They didn't ask, are you left-wing or right-wing? They just indiscriminately slaughtered, in a very brutal fashion, Israelis. And we have to remember...
Your critics have said that actually part of the battle over this, trying to block the overhauling of the judiciary that the government has been so keen to push through, has been part of the distraction which led to, in part, being caught off guard and being vulnerable to an attack by Hamas. That's what your critics say.
And so that's precisely the reason today we've got to put everything else aside. I mean, if that allegation is true, that's another reason why we have to put everything aside today, focus on a national effort. And as the reporter who you interviewed before me said, he obviously wasn't a great fan of the Prime Minister, but he said that on the goals of this war, to dismantle Hamas's military machine and to end its rule over the Gaza Strip and get our hostages home, there's a national consensus in Israel, from left to right. People who like the Prime Minister, people who don't like the Prime Minister. Israelis agree. We have to win this war. We have no choice.
Isn't one of the main reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu wants the reform is that so that he can strike down the corruption cases against him?
That has been said and resaid, but I really think this issue has to be put aside. It's like discussing
that. I don't know. But, sorry to interrupt, but the Brothers in Arms, who are an anti-overhaul group, and they're formed by reserve soldiers, have said we stand behind the independence of the Supreme Court. So they agree with this ruling. They want the Supreme Court to make this decision, and they said in the past that they'd made it clear they were unhappy going to war under a system where the Supreme Court's powers were being eroded, and that's why they were also part of the strikes out on the streets. They then decided they would fight when there was a moment, as you describe, of
Right.
national unity. But they're now saying that they stand by the independence of the Supreme Court.
And you'll have people in tanks in Gaza who are fighting and risking their lives today against those brutal Hamas murderers, killers, who support that view and who have a contrary view. I mean, Israeli politics, like politics in all democratic countries, can be polarized at times. It can be very passionate at times. We can debate these issues and argue about them until tomorrow. But the truth is, we are facing an existential threat from Hamas. And it's time to put all this aside. Not that anyone has to give up their positions.
Why not just agree with the finding from the Supreme Court and accept the decision?
Well, that's going to be the decision until this is over, until the conflict is over. Because once again, this is a time of working together, not a time for a divisive political debate. That's clear. It's almost as if during the Battle of Britain, to use an example from British history, that you'd have a huge argument, I don't know, about the level of local taxation. No. When you've got a bigger issue, an existential threat, you have to put everything else aside and deal with this threat, and that is the Hamas threat. We can no longer live next to this enclave where terrorists will at will cross the border and murder our people. It's unacceptable. Israeli civilians won't stand for that any longer, and it doesn't matter who they voted for. They will not stand for it any longer.
And so if you were to, obviously you're part of the government and you represent Mr. Netanyahu, but you personally, how would you feel about this ruling? Would you not think that the Chief Justice Esther Hyatt said that reasonableness was actually quite an important part of preventing government overreach?
Once again, you said yourself that there were 7 justices on one side and 8 on the other. And there were many differences of opinion. This is an issue that has divided Israeli society. And we're not going to solve it quickly in this conversation or in the next week or two. There's going to be a time for a comprehensive democratic dialogue on this issue. But it's clear that it has to be put aside until this war is won. It's common sense.
Mark Regev, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, heavy